Bona tarda, benvinguts, benvingudes de nou aquí a la que és ara la darrera sessió, l'última sessió ja de les nostres jornades. Estic encantat de que seguiu amb nosaltres. As previously, I'm going to switch into English for the session now, with a big thank you just now as well to our interpreters back in the box to make it all possible. And a big thank you for our two interlocutors for this final session, Thomas Meyer, Eva Geulen, who I'll be presenting in just a moment. And we're going to have a conversation, very Arendtian in spirit, of course, about, as you can see, the sort of triad of the lie, truth, and political action. And a fourth term that I snuck in there, and virtuosity, that we may or may not come to, we'll see. But I think there are probably no two more qualified people to join me on this panel. Eva Geulen is Professor of European History of Culture and Knowledge at the Humboldt University in Berlin, and also directs the Leibniz-Zentrum for Literary and Cultural Research, which is quite sort of a beacon for interdisciplinary work in Germany and probably in Europe as a whole. She's a lot of things, and I had a quick look at her publication list, and you sort of begin to scroll. So I'm not going to take you through it all. But in addition to running the center, she is also an executive member of the Humanities Center in Berlin and a member of the Berlin-Brandenburg Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and, as per one of the capital's newspapers, one of the 100 most important minds in Berlin science. I just find that particular one too. But the reason she's here with us is that she's published extensively on Hannah Arendt, including very explicitly on politics, lies, and truth. But she's also the team of general editors of the critical edition of Hannah Arendt's complete works, which will be a significant step in the scholarly work on Arendt, and also in absolute competition or complementary relationship with Thomas Meyer, one's big projects, which is his 12-volume study edition of Arendt's complete works in German, with paper forthcoming or already being in the process of being published. And for those of you who've not joined us yesterday, just to say that Professor Meyer is Professor of Philosophy in Munich, but also a freelance author in Berlin, and also writes significantly, and not just academically, but also for German broadsheets and radio. So, I should have mentioned Thomas's latest book is the biography of Hannah Arendt, which we discussed yesterday. I was told I needed to hold my mic better, and of which many Spanish translations are on sale outside. That's enough for me. I wanted to start us off, and we talked about this just a little, that in order to think about the lie and truth in a moment which is so complex and where it is so topical to be discussing these things, if we really want to think them through with Arendt, we need to think very much about what she actually understood by political action. It's very difficult to think through the importance of the lie and the importance of truth in her sort of understanding of politics if we don't start there just now. So maybe, may I turn to you first and ask you just very openly, very broadly about her conception of political action, what it is that we need to take into account before we launch into that conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We already heard quite a bit about it in the previous session, because Vita Activa, The Active Life, is the book in which she has probably most exhaustively and in great detail explained what her notion of action is. Now, the book has several parts, and she might not have a teleology, but there is a certain hierarchy in the modes, in the three modes of being active that she discusses. And we've already heard that. The first one is labor, the second one is the homo faber, the one who makes things, the producer, and the third one is the acting human being. And there are many forms of acting that she discusses in that chapter, but probably in her mind, the most important, or let's say the most dignified form of human acting is political action. And political action is so important because it's not something you can do alone. You have to act in concert with others. And because the political realm, which since Plato and Aristotle in the Western tradition has been denigrated for the sake of the opposite of the vita activa, namely the vita contemplativa, is what she wants to put kind of back in the forefront. And like I said, there are numerous ways of being active and acting, but the political action with others in a world of pluralities or diversity, as it was called just now, in a public realm, that for her is the highest and most noble and dignified form of action.
Thanks very much. And may I perhaps also turn to you, Thomas, and just to add a little to this, but I'm particularly interested in sort of teasing out the public element of that political action, where it is taking place, what it is, like the way that she conceives, particularly in the Vita Activa, how does she conceive of the space in which that takes place, and the way that we may be thinking about it in terms of the acting bit, in terms of acting in public and in concert.
Yes, well, that's a very complicated question because I have to, and you could already see that in Eva's answer, Vita Activa, and in English, The Human Condition, 2 different books, by the way, is organized by paragraphs, like Heidegger's Being and Time. That is very telling, but the book is not organized, so to speak. It's a typical Arendt book. It seems to be organized because of the paragraphs. Why I'm talking about the form and not the substance? Because also the form influences the substance. So you have to put together, I think, parts of the book to answer your question seriously. I would say, maybe it's a little bit provoking, I do hope at least, if we talk about the space, we have to talk about Arendt as a phenomenologist, because the so-called space of appearance is here a term that she got from the Frankfurt School of Psychology. Kurt Goldstein is here important, from the so-called Wahrnehmungspsychologie, has a specific a turn in Vita Activa and in the Human Condition. The space of appearance is something like this here, for example, or our conversation. It has different dimensions. It starts with passing by when you are at the Rambla, when you see someone attractive or interesting or whatsoever, or someone ugly. There is a connection. You see the eyes of the other, and there is a connection between the two persons, just for a second. And it is telling because it influences our impression of ourselves and of the other. And we do have that moment of plurality, and plurality is, so to speak, the basic element or the basic, let's say, category on which the whole construction, the phenomenological construction is innovated and then developed. Means we do have a kind of a hierarchy here, more stable moments of appearance together, like this here at our conversation means that we have the chance really to act or handeln. Arendt preferred handeln, the German word. Acting has a different horizon. It's hard. I still think that does not work, acting and handeln, but that's not our problem tonight. Back to the phenomenology I mentioned. Arendt is very much interested in how these moments of appearance can be stabilized. I would even say that her whole theory of institutions is based on the idea that the space of appearance can be transformed into institutions. You have that in On Revolution. And I think we will say more about that, but this is the framework. The space of appearance, I think, is the general term and the general framework in which she puts a lot of her observations and her arguments.
I think that's true, and it's also true to say that when people encounter each other, something happens. But I think when she talks about the public space, it is not something, before it can be stabilized, for example, by institutions, it has to be created. And it's not often that it is created, but revolutionary moments created, or the Resistance in France created it. So it is not something that is given, let's say, a space in which you can just enter through the door and then you're part of the public. It has to be constituted, it has to be claimed and reclaimed. And I think that reclaiming is constituting the space of appearance and stabilizing it for Arendt, above all, by laws, by legal phenomena, is itself already a form of political action. That's very clear, for example, from the book on revolution.
And what's really interesting is that she very often casts these moments in the terminology of performance. As a space, she talks about deeds which can be seen and words which can be heard, events which are talked about and remembered. So there's this performative element to her understanding of political action.
Yeah. The theory is not, Arendt's idea, I'm not a philosopher, first of all, a confession. No, I'm not a philosopher. I'm unfortunately in a philosophy department, and I'm trained as a philosopher by Jesuits and others, but I'm an historian of ideas. So I have to apologize that I will give you now a little bit of maybe historical background. So the chapter is, not the chapter, now I speak about chapters. The paragraphs about the space of appearance are highly interesting because there are a synthesis of different books which are never mentioned in Vita Activa or in the human condition. The basis is indeed the ancient theater, and she was very proud that she thought she understood very well Karl Reinhardt's book on Aeschylus, which was extremely important for her. This book on Aeschylus and theater by Reinhardt, one of the most famous classicists in the first half of the 20th century, and he died in 1958 in Frankfurt, is all about how actors in the ancient theaters appear on the stage. And Arendt liked the idea very much. That is why I thought I should start with the idea that we are sitting here and of course it will not be stabilized, as Eva said correctly. So at the end of the political theory, we speak about these very moments. Kant's Geschichtszeichen. The French Revolution will never be forgotten in the history of human beings, as I already said yesterday. You see, I repeat myself after 2 nights. That's not a good sign. Back to the idea of this moment. I would not against Eva, but for me, the element is important that it begins, let's say, in a contingent way. Someone appears. And then we will see what happens. Like, we talked a little bit before, but we did not know what we will say, really. We know each other for years, but we are not connected in personal or university terms. So it is not completely clear. And the question before we entered the stage was, you know each other well and you know what each of you will say. No, 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 on the contrary. And that is exactly this element of spontaneous and moments and contingency, as I said. And Arendt is very good developing this moment from both sides, from this already stabilized moments and with the possibility of creating and recreating after the revolutionary moments, and at the same time to begin from the bottom, as I said, in a phenomenological way, to see these elements of looking at each other, detecting and interpreting. How does someone look like? How do you react because of my, let's say, nervous attitude, and like this, and the translation of that, my body language, body politics is an important term. So we have, so to speak, two developments in the book, I think, and now we can try to bring them together. And I stop here.
Thank you. In fact, I'm going to take you into a slightly different direction. I think we could... Your unpredictability point, though, is very Arendt too. There's another paragraph in the book. But it's not where I'm going to take you right now, because I thought...
That's too bad.
If you want to comment, I can very unpredictable... but I wanted to take us onto the territory of our topic, beyond political action, namely truth and lies. As we obviously all know, we actually all think of ourselves as rather morally good citizens trying to lie less and exalt speaking the truth. But actually, I think, as psychological studies at least have shown, we do actually lie rather a lot. And as Arendt was fond of pointing out, the lie was itself not necessarily part of the Christian deadly sins either. So there's this ambiguity in which we're starting out. But if you would indulge me, I think it would be useful to think about the way the lie and truth have appeared in the history of thought, because these are some of the concepts that Arendt then works in or against. And a very kind of crude, perhaps, distinction could be between those on the Kantian side, the absolutist who says lying is never ever allowed, and more of the relativists who say, actually, under certain circumstances it is. So I wonder whether, can I turn to you, Eva, and ask whether you might want to talk a little about the kind of tradition out of which she then comes.
Yeah, even though Thomas is the expert for the history of ideas, and I think that falls into your responsibility. I will try to say something about this, but let me preface this, and now I am going to go where you didn't want me to go, to just say one more thing of what it means to act. The characteristic of acting in public is that you don't know what happens. Mm-hmm. You might try to take responsibility. You might say, I will try to say this. I have no control over how it's coming on, how it is received on the other side. And that means Goethe at some point said, only the person who does not act has a good conscience, right? Because when you act, you intervene in the world, and what the consequences of your actions are, and we know this in daily life, but we also know it in the big issues, technology, and so forth, you cannot possibly determine ahead of time what the consequences of your actions are. So acting, in a certain sense, is contrary to the dignity it has, is kind of always, if you want, irresponsible, right? So now, against this background, when we look at the tradition, there has been an attempt to make people adhere to truthfulness in order, that would be an argument Nietzsche made very beautifully, in order to make them accountable for their action. If I can rely on you saying the truth, I might have a chance to live with you in the world without your contingent actions ruining my plans, right? So there has always been a moral and philosophical privilege of truth over lie. But there are certain exceptions. I would say the French moralist tradition of the 17th century had a much more relaxed relationship. And that has to do with the fact that the 17th century was a time in which dissimulation, let's say faking it, appearing as someone who you are not, acting in a way that is not your authenticity, your individuality, but a persona, you assume, was valued. So in this context, the lie was also clearly a political tool. Machiavelli would be the case in point, right? Then there are others who have tried to at least reconstruct the history of how it came that people privileged truthfulness over lie, which seems so natural, and Nietzsche is among them. In the biblical context, in the religious and theological context, no, the lie is not among the 7 sins, and that is in a way confirmed, this kind of anthropological truth that lying seems to be a necessary fact of life, is confirmed by all these psychologists who have found out that we lie, some say 20 times a day, some say we lie 200 times a day. If you take that seriously, you can spend the day lying and the night thinking up counting the lies you have had, right? But hence, against this background, the privileging of lying is not exclusive to Arendt, but she's the one who has made it very important. And the connection to action is in I will do this later. Anyway, so that's my answer. You can add to that.
Do you want to add to it?
No, I don't want to add. I want to take another perspective on that, because when we, I can sign that completely. What Eva said. The different perspective would be to speak about truth and Hannah Arendt. It is interesting that Hannah Arendt is also in this respect an outsider, that she's not one of the important thinkers of the 20th century that does not deliver another definition of truth. Both of her teachers, Martin Heidegger and Karl Jaspers, were obsessed with the history of the term truth and how to destruct, not deconstruct, important difference, to destruct the traditional Christian philosophical idea of the adequatio theory, adequatio res theory, that things and the thinking about things have to be on the same level, intellectus et re, as Thomas Aquinas said famously. Highly discussed in the medieval time and very controversial, but Heidegger in Being and Time tried to destruct this idea, because for him it was part of the basis for the traditional metaphysics. And Karl Jaspers published his first major book after the war. It was not about guilt, but it was a 1,000 pages book about truth. And Arendt read that book very carefully, and now I get closer to our issue. Immediately you will see the context. The motto of The Origins of Totalitarianism, in all editions quoted in German, not translated by Arendt into English, is from On Truth by Karl Jaspers. And I have to give you, Eva's English is much better than mine, and your English, of course, too. So I give the Spanish audience the German saying of this. And it's very interesting to connect that then with the essay from 64 about Truth and Politics. Nicht der Vergangenheit und nicht der Zukunft anheimfallen, sondern ganz gegenwärtig sein.
So not to come to neither future nor past, but be entirely in the present.
Yeah, and the crucial word is anheimfallen, which is a very poetic concept. Yeah, but no, it's not about the correct translation, but also in German there is a ambivalence in this word anheimfallen. Mm-hmm. So Arendt is very much aware that the 20th century has already a history of how to deal with the concept of truth. And so her essay is motivated, first of all, because of the Eichmann controversy. We will speak about that in a second, but also because of the philosophical debates about truth in the 20th century. So that is in the background again. So another perspective, as I said, and not an adding to what Eva said.
Of course, and another perspective which works extremely well, because when you first read that essay, she has thought about and has written about the relationship of truth and lying to politics before, but this is the first essay, Truth and Politics, in which she actively, explicitly tackles the topic, as far as I'm aware at least. This is difficult territory here with the editors of those complete works, but in those moments, she actually comes out with a number of statements that, for the uninitiated, it is a surprise, because you would assume that she holds it with those who think about truth as an important standard in politics. And indeed, at the very end of the essay, she does come to that sort of phrasing in some sense, but she starts out saying that truth and politics have never really been on good terms with each other. And then actually launches into that very curious definition of truth, in many ways not being political at all. Do you want to take this further?
In fact, politics is the opposite of truth. Yeah, it's that clear cut. And what one has to say, however, and that is now adding to your 20th century focus on deconstructing, let's call it that, it's a Heidegger term, of deconstructing notion of truth. The opposition between politics and truth, as conceived mostly by philosophers, is much older than this. The beginning of that opposition is with Socrates, right? When Socrates took the poison and died by the law of the polis, by the political law, Aristotle and Plato and all these successors freaked out because they thought how could he sacrifice the truth for accepting the political rule of Athens at the time? And I think for her, this is an absolutely important and crucial moment from which arises the opposition, but also the tenuous, complicated relations between truth and politics. So that's another background story to that. But I would say that she makes it, in the essay you quote, she makes it abundantly clear that when truth enters the public realm of political action, exchange, and discussion, it is no longer truth, but it is an opinion, and it is always one opinion among others, and there's nothing nobody can do about it. That's one part. We should keep the various parts of the argument separate, but that is an important part, that in the realm of political action and interaction, truth is in a way not possible, and is not a standard, and is not a criterion, because it is forced in this, what she calls also the marketplace of ideas in the public sphere. It is forced to become one opinion among others. That's not the end of the story, but it's an important part of the argument.
Do you want to
No. I mean,
do you want to contradict?
Well, one can contradict in different forms. Let me say that for Arendt, indeed, as I said, what we discussed already yesterday in the conversation with Lindsay, we talked about the Socrates essay, which is in the really large literature on Socrates, not a complete exception, but an exception in the sense that she really tries to separate Socrates from Plato, which is an interesting operation. And if there is a dialogue in which it is possible or a good chance to establish such a difference, it's a Crito, which is very often underestimated. This is so-called little dialogue, one of the so-called early dialogues in the first tetralogia in the opera Omnia from Plato. There's a sentence that Arendt liked, and that the sentence shows exactly how complicated it is to act under a nomos, under a law. And the famous translation is, I think, it is worse to commit injustice than to suffer from it. And this is for Hannah Arendt, so to speak, the contradiction to the way Plato created in the Politeia his own state, and so she separates Socrates from Plato. But that is interesting and dialectical insofar as Socrates insists in the Crito, other than in the Apologia and other dialogues, that he must follow the law. So is the law then the question, back to our let's say major problem tonight, the lying and the relationship between political action and lying and truth? Has the law still the authority or to be truthworthy? And what does it mean when you act under the law? Because you think when you act under the law, it is the right thing to do. And the right thing to do is a thought experiment, a very important one, so to speak, the second step in this essay, because she says, fiat pereat mundus, and then she said, justitia. Yeah, instead of. So she brings justitia and truth together, and that is very, very telling for her.
Might this actually be the moment to take you up on your previous point and talk about Eichmann when we're talking about truth and the law? Or do you want
because if we go on now, we're going to go into a big fight about the Socrates essay, and we're not going to do that.
Can we do this over dinner? Thank you.
I'm very much interested in fighting with you, but I made no value judgment, Eva. There are big problems with the Socrates essay, no doubt about that, but I thought to bring to Okay. Sorry. Cut it. You get 5 minutes extra.
No, but I mean, well, so look, I'm quite interested in fights, so I'm very happy to take this further. I'm just thinking about the fact that if we do go down that route, we might not actually end up talking about some of those moments where we're trying to relate it to how we think with and against her today. So I just wondered maybe we can also bring this in at a moment, but I think the crucial point that you made around acting under the law and the question of truthfulness does bring us back to the reason she originally wrote that essay, but also why she was so clearly attacked about some of the things she said in the Eichmann book, and how she basically dealt with the fallout. So I just wondered if we wanted to bring it into that context. I'm not asking to add this.
No. We decided before that I'm the bad cop, so I will speak about Eichmann in Jerusalem. So Arendt says very clearly in the essay, at least in the English version, not in the German version of Truth and Politics, that she started thinking about this problem because of the so-called Eichmann controversy, and that many of her enemies foes. There were not any longer critics, some of them at least. According to Arendt, lied simply about what she wrote. Misquoting, decontextualization, prejudgments, and so on and so forth were tools to corrupt her book and the idea of the book, again, according to Arendt. And very telling is here, may I, as one of her biographers, may I go for a second together with you into one of the archives I visited when I analyzed the so-called Eichmann controversy. I wondered why the New York Times asked a judge who was criticized in the book, his name is Musmano, to write the review in the famous New York Times. And it's an awful review, not only because of all the misquotings and all the things I told you before, misquoting, decontextualization, and so on and so forth. But also he sent beforehand around 20 pages kind of an essay with the title Hannah Arendt, an Anti-Semite. And he quotes from the book, or he quotes or paraphrases the book, and then he says, and this is anti-Semitic. And exactly that happens in the review. So Arendt had very good reasons to start to think about lying and what it means to lie about facts, because what most of the critiques not were able to find in the book were really factual errors. There were some misprints in the names. She misrepresented some SS hierarchies, and she misrepresented some contexts. But factual facts, now I double it for good reasons, they were not able to find. So it was more about lying, according to Arendt, to get her in the position of being, for example, an anti-Semite, like Musmano said in the New York Times. That was the beginning, so to speak, or one of the reasons to think in a very fundamental way about truth and politics.
Isn't it then really interesting the way that the essay begins? Because you would expect from the way that you are phrasing it that she would go all out on the importance of re-establishing truth, values, and standards, and you know, in some ways critiquing the deployment of the lie. And obviously, it is something that she is intensely interested in. That's why she writes it. But it's not what she does in the beginning of the essay. You know, we come to the point where she wonders very critically about the difficult effects of the lie in politics, but she also starts out talking about its enormous potential in political terms. And I think it's quite beautiful in many ways what she writes about it. And it has to do with freedom and has to do with imagination. And I think it's worth exploring that a little.
Yeah, for Arendt, the lie is evidence that we are free human beings. It is evidence of our freedom. Why? Because, and that has to do with acting again, I can imagine the world in a way in which it is not. I can imagine another world. Now you could say, of course, that is not freedom, that is imagination. But when you lie, and particularly when you lie about facts, you are intervening. You're trying to make the world different. And making the world a different place is the power of action, and what is presupposed and what is required is freedom. And in that sense, lying as an act, not just as a fancy, as something I imagine, but as a purposeful act with which I intervene in the world is for her a sign of our freedom, and our freedom is for her always there manifest, where we can change the world from the way it is now and make it different.
And she says this quite beautifully. She says, our ability to lie, but not necessarily our ability to tell the truth, belongs among the few obvious, demonstrable data that confirm human freedom. And this is obviously the moment when you begin to think, oh, she does take us down a route that I wasn't quite expecting, where she becomes unpredictable for those who haven't read her much before. But again, I think that relationship to action, of the capacity to change the world, is so important. That's because truth has a despotic character, because it precludes debate. It doesn't change anything, it just is what she says in another part of the essay.
Yeah, but if I remember correctly, yes, all truths are despotic. Yeah, that is certainly true, because there is no other possible world next to the true world. And in the sense that it rules out all other possible worlds, it is despotic. Right? And then it doesn't matter whether they are truths that we believe in, so-called truths, what are they called? Vernunftwahrheiten?
Rational truths.
Rational truths, or whether they are factual truth. There is something despotic in the notion of truth. That's certainly true. And despotism is the opposite of freedom.
But then obviously, sorry, Thomas, please.
Yeah, that is a radical position. It's highly interesting. I listened to both of you, and I thought, for example, that Jaspers tried to offer, let's say, a kind of a middle ground, that truth has to do with communication. Yeah, Habermas famously developed in the 1973 in a famous article his own theory of truth, and it's about communication. We don't have to discuss that, but Arendt is more than clear, because I think what you already in the opening of the essay can see, at least between the lines, that she thinks because philosophers have the tendency that to write down truth always with a capital T, that they get again despotic, because they realize that philosophy has not any longer this, of course it's an imagination by the so-called philosophers, the central role of being the shareholders of the and the truth holders in the world, and that they have to make sure that the truth with a capital T is the epicenter of everything. And because of that, there is a kind of a renouveau vérité, a kind of a new despotic, as Eva said, idea of that philosophy should be, don't forget in brackets, that in 1960, Hans-Georg Gadamer published Truth and Method, which is a witz, I would say. No, it's a joke, because the title makes no sense. Maybe not the book. I'm not sure about that. But at least it was also a re-establishing of the idea of truth, and based on more or less a Heideggerian hermeneutics. So if you take Arendt very seriously, I think all these kind of, let's say, events around her in the philosophical world, and what I said and Eva said about the historical contexts, the history of ideas, and also Arendt's own context, then the essay gets even more ambitious and interesting, because it is also what we call in German with a terrible word, Debattenbeitrag, which means an article that articulates a certain Unwohlsein, discomfort with the whole situation of the concept of truth. And lying and preferring lying in a certain sense is I would say, the most extreme provocation.
Yeah, I thought you were going there. You're saying this is just a provocation and truth isn't out the window entirely. Now, that is true. How should it not be true? But what we have to realize is that the philosophical tradition, and that does go back to Plato and the theory of the state, in which the philosopher was supposed to run the joint. Right? The philosopher was basically running the state and the polis, and that she abhorred, hence the strong opposition. But what we must not forget is that at the end of the human condition, vita activa, after she has been through all these modes of acting, she says, there is one mode of acting that I have excluded here entirely, and it is the highest form of acting, and that is thinking. Yeah? So thinking is also a form of acting, and there is a space for that, and it is called when you are with yourself, when you talk to yourself alone, and then you are more active than when you ever are. But it is a qualitatively different and different kind of action than what you do in the public sphere and when you act with others in concert. And once you come from this philosophical place of truth and you enter the public sphere, you cannot maintain your true standards. If you do, you get a philosopher king a la Plato. Just so there is, it's not that truth is being demolished. It's not like a Nietzschean argument to say it's all a matter of perspective and there is no truth. It's not that. There is a time and a space for truth. But politics ain't it.
Yeah, but okay, let us go in this direction for a second. She says thinking and not philosophizing, and I think that words matter, or terms. It's a different form of being with yourself. I agree, and the life of the mind tries to develop that as a concept in the traditional terms of the vita contemplativa. So that is the unfinished work, only two manuscripts are complete more or less, and now we have, thanks to dear colleagues from the critical edition, the wonderful chance to learn how Arendt tried to conceptualize and how she outlined this work before the edition was not manipulated but heavily edited by Mary McCarthy. So now you have to buy the Waldstein edition in English, fortunately. And the thinking is the important act. It's not any longer philosophizing. Yeah. So, yeah. So and I don't have to defend Plato. That other people can do that. But the philosopher king appears only in the Politeia, and then he kicked him out.
Yeah, but Arendt insisted that this was the crucial deed.
Yeah.
That's what matters, right?
Well, so, but before before we scare everybody thinking that Arendt really thought the truth was absolutely contrary to politics, which is true, but at the same time the lie could only be the way forward for politics, that's not exactly what she puts. In fact, there is a big chunk of the argument in particularly that article, but also in Lying in Politics and her last address, Coming Home to Roost, is very much about the abuses or the extremes of lying, of organized lying, in an age of what she calls mass manipulation of beliefs and opinion, and that's slightly separate, also and particularly under totalitarianism. So I think we probably should talk about that, shouldn't we?
There are certainly, you can't get rid of the lie, but you can limit lying, and you have to, particularly when factual truths are at issue. Right? But factual truths are because they are contingent, and they're often the result of actions that you cannot predict. They could have been that way or another way. The one thing that protects the fact, the true fact, from the lies that try to explain it out of the world, is for Arendt, and that's a very interesting notion, is that facts are completed. They are past. They are no longer in the present. And therefore, they are kind of removed from the grasp. Now, we know that there are lots of revisionist histories around, but we also know that it is not very hard to show a Holocaust denier that he is lying. We do have the facts, right? And they have to be protected, they have to be archived, they have to be cultivated, they have to be reflected, they have to be passed on. And there are institutions that are responsible for this task, and among them she counts the universities, the historians, the philosophers, particularly the humanities, she also counts the law and the free press. They can never guarantee, but they can act to protect factual truth. And that's one way to limit lies. There is, that's one way, and there's, however, also another way. Because you could say, if you apply it to our situation, when do we know when we have a conspiracy theory in front of us? And Arendt implicitly argues the liar, the systematic liar, tends to ignore the fact that the world is contingent and that things don't fit together. And every time you encounter an architecture of lies in which every little detail fits with everything else, where everything, it's like a paranoid mind, when you cannot see that everything is the same conspiracy, and that is yet another proof, then you haven't done anything against it yet, but that, she says, is one way of recognizing lies when every part fits the lid. That's maybe not much, but I think it is a helpful way to begin to think whether you are dealing with a web of lies, which is often more, this is what makes conspiracy theories so attractive, that the lies have a coherency that the real world never has. Our world is not coherent, right? We can't even have a coherent conversation with each other. The world is not coherent. Right? No, I'm saying it. We don't even know what we're saying. So when, however, we were in a conspiracy world, then everything fits together. So there are institutions that protect factual truths, and there are ways of knowing when you are dealing with a web of lies. I can get into the organized lying later, but those are the two ways. And I think it's time we brought this out in the open, how to limit the effects of lies, because they can be detrimental. Oh, and one thing. I went into the conspiracy theories, but she also knew about this, but she wasn't so interested. She just was more interested in political systems in which we have something, a conspiracy theory come alive in a totalitarian state. And in totalitarian states, the sense of lie and truth disappears. And when that sense, the liar needs to know that he lies, if he wants to be an effective liar. Machiavelli told you all about this, how to lie in politics to get what you want. But when you have a totalitarian state in which the difference between truth and lie is no longer and fact and lie, then you have what she calls Totalfiktion, total fictions. And like conspiracy theories, totalitarian states are total fictions, and not just fictions, but they are fictions come real.
And this is probably where we end up in some respects in the current day, in different categorizations. She makes a big difference between the totalitarian situation and the situation of where simply sort of beliefs and opinions are being manipulated. We are maybe in a sort of in-between stage today in some ways.
I mean, then one should say what she called organized lying. She unfolded by discussing the Pentagon Papers. At some point, close to the end of after the Vietnam War was over, the Pentagon released all these documents. And it turned out that the politicians, the government, had known the factual truth, but there were PR people, public relations people, there were problem solvers, there were people who were engaging in quasi-conspirational, game-theoretical accounts of what would happen when and tried to predict the future. And they got so wrapped up in their world that we had a moment of an organized lying. But what is important and was different to totalitarian states is that the facts were readily available. Everybody knew what was happening in the Vietnam War, right? The facts, the numbers, the killed, the soldiers, everything, that it didn't go anywhere, the famous quagmire, all of this was out in the open, the press was there, but it didn't reach the political sphere, who were kind of enclosed in the self-produced web of organized lying. For bad motives, but motives to be distinguished from those in a totalitarian regime.
Thank you. I think this is actually a very good moment to now open up to some questions of the floor. I think we have about 15-20 minutes, if the interpreters allow, slightly more than originally planned. But could you please also wait for the microphone? There's the gentleman in the front here, mainly so that the interpreters will also hear what you're saying and can therefore translate for those who require. And just a reminder also, you're very welcome to asking questions in English or in Spanish or Catalan. Bettina, just here in the front. The gentleman here, yes. Thank you.
Hace unos años un funcionario, creo que era de la Comisión Europea, dijo: sabemos lo que tenemos que hacer para resolver el problema económico, pero si lo hacemos vamos a perder las elecciones, los distintos gobiernos. Se me ocurre el ejemplo de Vietnam también. Si el gobierno norteamericano de la época hubiera dicho: en realidad estamos procurando en una guerra fría evitar que avance el bloque soviético comunista y vamos a matar a quien sea para lograr esto, quizás el gobierno no se hubiera mantenido. Es decir, en la política, que no es la ciencia, se miente por una cuestión de poder y de intereses y de imponer un programa, a diferencia de, se supone que en la ciencia se busca la verdad de los hechos. La pregunta es, ¿qué pasa con el otro lado, ¿no? La población, ya no los políticos, sino los ciudadanos y la población, una persona que no está en el poder, que no busca el poder en sí mismo, que decide creer esas mentiras. A mí me impacta esto, ¿no? Desde terraplanistas a cualquier teoría de conspiración, antivacunas, etcétera, etcétera, ¿no? Es decir, ¿qué pasa con la gente de a pie, digámoslo así? Ya no los políticos profesionales, que hasta necesitan, parecería ser, que les mientan, están felices, porque si le dicen la verdad, por ejemplo, no los van a votar. Con algunas excepciones tipo Churchill, ¿no? Con sangre, sudor y lágrimas, ¿no? Y alguno que otro más en la historia, ¿no? ¿Qué pasa con esto? ¿No será una necesidad de mucha gente vivir en estos mundos donde todo es perfecto, ¿no? Las conspiraciones, todo tiene una lógica y una explicación clara? ¿Cuál es, digamos, o qué conceptos desde Hannah Arendt nos sirven para entender esto?
So, I think because we were sort of looking for the translation, I'm not sure whether you got the question from the beginning. Okay, Thomas, do you want to attempt an answer?
Thank you for your question. Yes, I think all the liberal democracies and other democracies are occupied with this kind of question you asked. The most extreme form is the mob, the organized form of uncontrolled mass that is already manipulated and tries to bring this kind of conspiracy theory into real politics. And Arendt has a famous, highly interesting chapter about the mob and its organization and the form of the mob. By the way, a very old term from the 15th century, originally in English, and the mob as a new form of a political actor. By the way. The mob is disqualified. When you hear mob, you are not interested. I'm not part of a mob, of course not. I have a doctor title. I can never be a part of a mob, something like this. It seems to be a class phenomenon, a low-class phenomenon. People, the proletariat or something, even less Lumpenproletariat, exactly. So that's sad. But we are now occupied with, I think you have that in mind, with right-wing and left-wing populism. Because they, like Nigel Farage, we can name them. I'm a guest here in Spain. I don't want to talk about the Spanish situation. I do not know enough about that. But we have it in Great Britain with Nigel Farage, who is now proud of his Nazi-schmazi. And we have the AfD, we have Le Pen, and we have, of course, the 47th President of the United States. So we will find actually these people are not any longer alone. They are very welcomed in parties and organizations. You cannot even think about the most crucial conspiracy theories. They will find a place, so to speak. They are not any longer isolated. They can find easily a voice, so to speak. And then people say, we cannot, it's not fair in a democracy for a Democrat, for a Republican to forget one single soul. So even the one who's already a victim, of course not from the inside, of a conspiracy theory is very welcomed because he has a different opinion. He has a different concept of truth, maybe. So he and she and it must have the chance to express his or its own ideas, and so we try to give him or her a voice. And that's, I think, already very successful, this kind of integrating people who think that the majority is still left liberal. If you really want to accuse someone in Germany nowadays, you do not say he's a communist or he's gay or something like this, or queer. You say he's left liberal. It's the worst thing you can be nowadays in Germany. It's all the worst thing in the world happened is, at least in the German feuilleton, it's to be a left liberal. And if you're not a left liberal, you're very welcomed in this left wing and right wing. I include the left wing populism for very good reasons, I think, and in the right wing populism. So this, what you described, is already a political factor, and we see the rise of this political factor day by day.
Yeah, thank you for the question. Perhaps two remarks. One is that indeed what we are observing is a populism that does employ not exactly conspirational, but a kind of organized lying. Yeah, I would say that. And the more coherent the worldview articulated, whether from the left or the right, the more problematic it gets. And I think what everybody now always implores, the middle, the so-called middle, doesn't exist anymore. It's a fiction that it exists. They all want, but your question goes to the heart of the question of how we want to live in a democracy. And from Arendt's point of view, I would grant you, she did not have much sympathy for professional politicians. right? The moments where she got excited about politics, she was an avid reader of Rosa Luxemburg, and she was very excited, for example, about the student movements in the US, in California and Berkeley in the late 60s, when there was a motion, a new movement, right? But I think that with the question of how we now live in this democracy, I'm not sure she can help us that much anymore, because she believed that the public sphere could be created instantaneously and then things would change politically, socially, right? Like in a revolution. But what we have today, where we have what is called bubbles, that is to say independent, competing publics, is in part due to the technology that we have, is something I'm not sure whether she can help us on that front, right? Because she did, no. And I think two strong analogies, let's say, between organized lying in the 70s in the Pentagon paper and what we live through now, I think there would be differences, because we're not yet at a totalitarian state, but somewhere in between. And one more thing is that what I said before, that the pastness of facts is what means we can insist on the truth, on the true fact, right? Today, a lot of the facts that we deal with, for example, climate change, is not about past facts. It's about predicting future. And I think that's something she does not have anything to say about, because she didn't have that technology in question of modeling, simulation, so on and so forth, and predicting into the future. Those are problems where I think we're mostly on our own, which doesn't mean she doesn't have to say it. A lot of things she says resonate with us, but they're certainly not ready-made solutions for the situation that you're describing.
Do we have any other questions? Right there in the front again. I think we probably have time for one or two more. So this being one, and then.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to return to the idea of virtuism, performativity, and appearance in Arendt, and ask about other forms of action beyond discourse, because I believe that sometimes she maybe overestimate the idea of the role, or the role, sorry, of discourse in politics. And what about other forms of actions? Thank you.
It wasn't about talking, it was about acting. For example, assembly and protest, right? That was very much a form of action that was very important for her. So politics is certainly not even exhausted by discourse. She does mean action in a very literal sense, yeah?
I take the chance to answer your question and to mention again the book I mentioned already last night. There is this book on revolution, and in a way, a kind of a critical second part is the crisis in the Republic. It refers to her own republicanism, but in between is the book on the Hungarian Revolution. I really love that book. Also because Rosa Luxemburg plays a very important role in the book. And I think it is one of the most underestimated works, a small book on the Hungarian Revolution from '58, yeah.
And that was all about unpredictable action.
Yeah, exactly.
Very, very much so.
Yeah.
And not organized by parties and not organized by reliable institutional structures. It was really an uprising, right?
Yeah.
And that's what she was interested in.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, yeah.
And so unpredictable, in fact, that it ended up failing, so that's why she took it out of the previous context. Yep. but that too is part of politics. Do we have one more? Well, on this very unpredictable moment then.
The end is predictable.
The end is predictable. This very at that point in time. Thank you both so much for a wonderfully lively conversation. Thanks to you for being part of it. Thank you to our interpreters for doing their magic. Thank you to the Goethe Institute for making it all possible, to the Ateneu for hosting us, for the Universitat de Barcelona to come and sit in and be so actively involved, and to everybody else here.
And Uta Staiger for organizing it and correctly sitting in the middle. Thank you.